Hi all, my name is Ryan and welcome to my channel What the Pop, where we discuss pop culture in general and Buffy a lot. The usual spoiler alert. I may talk about things in these analyses that relate to future plot points, so if you haven't seen all of Buffy at least once and don't like spoilers, I suggest you like the channel and then come back once you've seen it all. Today we continue our look at Season 2 with my review and analysis of Episode 18, Killed by Death. A plot summary. Buffy is all gross and fluey, but her solid work ethic means she's out patrolling. She runs into the gang and they all run into Angelus. Angelus beats Buffy, but the Scoobies ward him off. Buffy collapses. She's rushed to hospital, but objects to being there. Joyce reveals Buffy was present when her cousin Celia died in a hospital. How convenient for the plot. Buffy has a Slayer dream and sees a Freddy Krueger knockoff following some kid. She wakes up, goes on a walking tour, sees a dead kid, hears doctors arguing about treatment, and gets told by some kids that death is coming for them. Conveniently for Death, adults can't see him. Angelus tries to pay Buffy a hospital visit, but Xander and his balls of brass stop him. The next day, Buffy is fine, but is being kept for observation. The Scoobies visit, and Buffy tells them about the doctors arguing. Buffy mentions the demon, Cordy psychoanalyzes her perfectly, sort of. Xander and Cordy search the records room, all old school folders. They have a little jealousy moment after. Buffy finds Ryan in the hospital. He's drawn her a pic of death. Willow finds out the doctor is shady and should have lost his medical license ages ago. Buffy sees the doc get shredded and dragged away. You guess he's not the killer after all. Buffy informs the Scoobies, shows them Ryan's pic. They do what the Scooby-Doobies do. After finding out how Kinderstock kills, Buffy has flashbacks to her cousin, realising Kinderstock killed her. Apparently Buffy needed more motivation other than dead kids to slay this thing. Willow points out incorrectly that Buffy saw Kinderstock, and that it was her fever. No, Buffy saw him in a Slayer dream. Getting infected was dumb. Buffy has already fought something invisible before. Though a tactic for that sucked too. Buffy's fever goes up, she sees Kinderstock, he goes after the kids in the basement. Willow uses her frog phobia to distract security guards. Buffy gets to the basement, fights Kinderstock and snaps his neck. That's 2 neck snaps in a row. Buffy recovers at home, being waited on by Joyce. She brings her another drawing Ryan did. This review and analysis is not going to be particularly long because this episode is fairly shallow and doesn't hit its metaphor particularly well. This is the last episode written by the writing duo of Rob Dietel and Dean Batali, and, well, it's a strange episode. I read somewhere that this was supposed to be a Season 1 episode, and it feels like it, but I can't find anything that confirms that claim. It's not a bad episode at all. In fact, it's one that I don't really mind watching. I think the Kinderstock may actually be the creepiest looking and acting creature in all 7 seasons. I think it's creepier than the Gentleman in Season 5. Now this may just be because the Kinderstock looks a lot like Freddy Krueger, and Nightmare on Elm Street gave me nightmares until I was about 11 years old. But this is a bit of a non-episode. It is a throwback to the type of TV that existed before Buffy came along, in that there is nothing in this episode of any real consequence for our characters, either plot-wise or overall character development-wise. In other words, if this episode didn't exist, you'd never notice its omission. It is the very definition of a filler episode, which makes it very out of place in Buffy because there are very few filler episodes in Buffy, with most episodes contributing to the journey our characters are going through or the overall story arc of the season. And this episode does neither with any real purpose. We can look for metaphor here. Cordelia gives a rather blunt attempt at one.
So this isn't about you being afraid of hospitals because your friend died and you want to conjure up a monster that you can fight so you can save everybody and not feel so helpless?
And honestly, if that had been the metaphor, it would have made a far more interesting story. But the problem here is that's not the case. The Kinderstock is a real monster. It's not something Buffy has just conjured up. The story elements around the Kinderstock are really contrived. First, we're made to think that Buffy is seeing things that Kinderstock isn't real, and Buffy just imagined a monster as something physical she could fight. Now Buffy didn't actually see him at first. Buffy was having a Slayer dream. How do we know that? Well, the time ticks over from 2:26 to 2:27 as Buffy wakes up and sees a kid in her doorway and Dekindestop follow him. She then gets out of bed and follows, has visions of her as a child in the hospital when her cousin died. Then she actually wakes up and the time ticks over from 2:26 to 2:27. Joel suggests to Willow that it may be the Doctor, and research into him suggests he may be a little dodgy. At that point, this episode reflects nightmares from season 1, when a child sees an adult, a normal adult, as a monster because of what he did. This doesn't last long when Buffy sees the Doctor get shredded because his treatment was working to help the kids. We learn that Dekindestop is invisible to adults, so conveniently can only be seen by kids, and then we find out that those kids need to be sick too. It's explained that Dekindestop feeds on sick kids, sucking out their life essence so it looks like they died from their illness. But why feverish kids can see him is simply a means of giving him a face and a convenient story plot so that someone can say, no, the monsters are definitely real. And this is really where this episode fails as a story. It would have been a better story had all those elements remained in play right up until the actual reveal. If we'd been left wondering, is it all in Buffy's head, is it the Doctor, or is it an actual monster, it would have made a far more intriguing narrative. But this story proposed an idea, then almost immediately took it out of contention. It's amateurish storytelling at best. The whole plot about Celia dying in a hospital, why Buffy watched her die, which is why Buffy's afraid of hospitals, is a complete waste of screen time. Why? Because it was entirely unnecessary. It's supposed to give Buffy a reason for really wanting to kill Dekindestop, and for making Buffy believe in it. But this is achieved by other means in the episode. Buffy has a Slayer vision, Ryan tells her the monster is taking kids, and she sees it kill the Doctor and bump into her on the way out. So she knows it's real. And this monster is killing kids, and she's the Slayer. That's all the motivation she needs. Furthermore, Buffy's supposed fear of hospitals never resurfaces in the future, despite other hospital visits. Basically, if that entire subplot was removed, it would make almost no difference to the main story presented here. The only thing I will say though is that Denise Johnson, the child who plays Celia, when she's being attacked, actually looks truly terrified. So it does add to the fear of Dekindestop. Despite the episode being meh, like most episodes of Buffy, this episode still has some great character interactions that I love. First is just David Boreanaz in general. I've watched David Boreanaz through 3 seasons of Buffy plus cameos, 5 seasons of Angel, and 12 seasons of Bones. I haven't watched any of Steel Team, mainly because war stuff just doesn't interest me. But David is at his absolute best as an actor when he's Angelus. He eats that role up, and any time he's on screen as Angelus are just some of my favourite character scenes in Buffy and Angel. Like Juliet Landau always strikes that perfect balance as Drusilla, David is that perfect balance of menacing vampire sociopath and camp over-the-top quippy supervillain. Like this line here.
You know, you being off your game's kind of taking the fun out of all this. Nope, still fun.
He just has so much fun when he's Angelus, and you can tell that David loved playing him this way. One of my other favourite scenes in this episode is with Angelus and Xander.
If I decide to walk into Buffy's room, do you think for one microsecond that you could stop me? Maybe not. Maybe that security guard couldn't either. Or those cops. Or the orderlies. But I'm kind of curious to find out. You game?
Xander as a character often gets shredded for some of the misogynistic things he says and does. God knows I'm one of the people that do it. But this is one of those occasions where it seems like he has to be the hero and that he's White Knighting Buffy. But none of it in this scene is performative. He's not doing it to impress his friends. He's not doing it to score points with Buffy. There's no one around to see him do it. He's doing it because that's who he is. He would genuinely stand in front of a train if it meant saving his friends. We see him do it at the end of season 6 to save the world. This is a perfect example of why, metaphorically, Xander is seen as Buffy's heart. And his visible relief that Angelus does back down is such a small but great acting moment from Nicholas Brendon. But let's not forget that Xander hates Angel. He always has. And his line, "You're going to die and I'm going to watch," is so full of malice. The ultimate culmination of his feelings towards Angel. Cordelia in this episode is particularly astute, which is why I get annoyed with episodes that have her play dumb. Because she's not Harmony. She's never been a ditz. The line in this episode about plastic surgery and the thing on Buffy's face is exactly the sort of thing I mean though. Similar to the car joke last episode, they're played for laughs but most of the time aren't particularly funny and generally get dragged out too long. But in this episode she has two particularly astute scenes. The one I showed earlier of her psychoanalyzing Buffy, and one where she points out to Xander that he's still into Buffy and it's not attractive. But this scene is my favourite one of hers. Despite pointing out that Xander still has a thing for Buffy, and that is not attractive, she still brings him donuts and sits with him. As the What If Buffy, it's a great moment that cements their relationship. She genuinely cares for him and isn't threatened by his feelings for Buffy. In a great moment of world continuity, we get this scene from Willow.
Okay, come on now. You can do this the easy way.
Frogs, get them off of me! Oh my god, frogs, get them off of me, please! Help! Get them off! Frogs! Oh my god, frogs! Get them! Not her, the other one! No more frogs.
Her frog phobia was mentioned in What's My Line, and its reappearance here provides a good reason for her performance that distracts the guards. Anthony Stewart Head in this episode does a great deal of subtle acting here, playing a man who is grieving but trying to mask that grief and get on with his job. His interaction with Willow as she tries to focus him on research rather than doubting Buffy is a beautiful character moment between the two. One of the scenes I really love in this episode is the last one, where they are all laying in Buffy's room and Joyce brings Buffy the drawing from Ryan and they ask for snacks and drinks. And they're really milking it. It's one of the first scenes where we really see that Joyce is becoming a stand-in parent for Xander and Willow as well. As we know, both their parents are rather absent. The very funny Willie Garson, best known for playing Stanford in Sex and the City, plays the security guard that Cordelia distracts in this episode. Garson passed away in September of 2021. This whole season has been about Buffy growing up, essentially her adolescence. She left behind her childhood in season 1, and this season focused largely on her sexual maturation, on becoming a woman. Because, as I've mentioned before, according to TV and movies, you only become a real man or real woman once you've had sex. Now this season has shown how that portrayal seldom translates to real life. Buffy is no more or no less a woman now having had sex than she was before doing so. And Innocence highlighted that despite having lost her virginity, Buffy is still an innocent. She's still growing up. Now, one of the metaphors that this episode reaches for is again that transition from the innocence of youth into adulthood, and the reality that comes with that. We see that kids, sick kids, kids at their most vulnerable, are the only ones who can see this monster. And when kids tell adults about monsters, adults are dismissive, and the kids aren't believed. Giles highlights that point here when he favours looking into the doctor rather than looking for an actual monster. Now, this is appropriate in the real world, as one thing Scooby-Doo taught us all is that people are the real monsters, something we learn as we grow up. But of course this is Buffy, and monsters are real in the Buffyverse. There is something monstrous about child death though, something almost unfair, so that the invisible De Kinderstodt seems particularly monstrous. But De Kinderstodt itself is a metaphor for growing up. De Kinderstodt is German for child's death, and is a creature that is unseen, completely invisible to adults and normal children, but can be seen by sick kids at their most vulnerable. Kinderslot takes these kids without much of a fight. We get this scene.
He comes at night. The grown-ups don't see him. He was with Tina. He'll come back for us.
Who?
Death.
In this scene we see almost the resignation that it's going to happen, that the Kinderslot is going to get them. Now the one thing that kills most kids, that we are resigned to, and takes them without much of a fight, and that affects a child's death, is growing up. The Kinderslot represents the death of our childhood in the transition to adulthood. It is something inevitable and unseen that just creeps up on us all, and then our childhood is gone. Buffy is sick here because of Jenny's death. Her guilt at being unable to kill Angelus is eating at her and manifesting itself in illness. She's literally making herself sick. Joyce even says Buffy never gets sick. This sickness makes her childlike and vulnerable. A reversion back to a childlike state, a reminder that the journey to adulthood isn't a straight line. It is one of steps and setbacks and side trails. What has initiated this reversion to a vulnerable childlike state is failure. The Slayer journey is a metaphor for Buffy's growth to adulthood, and failure and setbacks are a part of that journey. No one ever makes it to adulthood free of the trauma of failure. And Buffy has had failures before, but none of them have ever been a direct outcome of her actions or lack of action. And this failure has shown something that Buffy already knew, that she learned in the Dark Age with Giles's past, that adults aren't infallible. They are human and they make mistakes. What Buffy is now realizing is that when she makes mistakes, it costs lives. Her burden as an adult, as the Slayer, is a heavy one. The important thing for Buffy here is that she moves beyond this failure, beyond the guilt she feels for it. At the end of Innocence, she told Angelus to give her time. And at the end of Passion, we saw that she had dedicated herself to killing Angelus, that she had made that choice. We see in the next episode that she will actually forgive herself for her part in Angelus losing his soul. We saw in the flashback that even as a child she was Power Girl, who is basically a multiverse version of Supergirl in DC Comics. So even back then, when she was a vulnerable child, pre-Slayerdom, she was the hero. Despite being sick and vulnerable, she kills the Kinderslot rather easily, simply snapping his neck. And this is an interesting contrast between her and Angelus from last episode. When Angelus snapped Jenny's neck, he was very much the predator. And I said that because of his orgasm face, that it gave a strong rape metaphor. Here, the Kinderslot pins Buffy and extends his phallic eyes in another rape metaphor, and Buffy, weakened and pinned, still snaps his neck. She is no victim. And the lesson for Buffy here is that even at her most vulnerable, she is still the Slayer, she is still the hero, and most importantly, she is still Buffy. A lesson she will need for the season finale and her showdown with Angelus. My favourite quote in this episode is this one.
Cordelia, have you actually ever heard of Tact?
Tact is just not saying true stuff. I'll pass.
As someone who has a tendency not to filter what they say, I relate to this a lot. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell. It helps the channel a lot. You can also support the channel through Patreon. If you disagreed with anything I said or have anything to add, please put it in the comments below and I'll see you next video.